This is an enterprise by Medico Abroad to highlight the importance of self-study amongst medical students. Medicine is a vast subject, and the more you study it, the more you realize that every bit of knowledge gained is but a drop in a never-ending ocean. This is an effort to assist future physicians, and it should not by any means be treated as a substitute for regular classes. Now, having said that, one does gather a lot of knowledge during the medical course, but it's like leading a horse to water. How much the horse drinks is definitely up to the horse, isn't it? But on a more serious note, once you become doctors, you become trustees of the human body. The well-being of your patient is your responsibility. Therefore, you must equip yourself with all the knowledge that you can gather. There's an old Chinese proverb which says, you hear and you forget, you see and you remember, you do and you learn. There can be no substitute to the student's initiative to learn better and to do more. You can augment your knowledge from a number of books. The study of bones is called osteology. There are about 206 bones in the human body. Now, the arrangement of the bones inside the human body is called a skeleton. As we have already said, there are about 206 bones which are arranged as a skeleton in the human body. Now, the skeleton, if we are to study it, it can be actually divided into two parts. One contains the bones which fall in the midline of the body, and the other set is the bones which lie away from the midline of the body. So, the bones that lie in the midline are called axial skeleton. The bones that lie away from the midline constitute the appendicular skeleton. The bones that lie in the midline of the body constitute your axial skeleton. The bones that lie in the limbs which are away from the midline constitute the appendicular skeleton. Therefore, the skull, vertebral column, ribs, pelvis all come under the axial skeleton because they are in the midline of the body. Now, those parts which are away from the midline, which are connected to these areas, are the upper limb and the lower limb bones. Therefore, the upper limb and lower limb bones constitute the appendicular skeleton. Now, let's look at how these bones are actually arranged. First, we have the axial skeleton. You have the skull, which is like a box, and it encloses certain structures. It encloses the brain and the eyes. The brain and the eyes. The cavity inside the skull is called cranium. The cavity inside the skull is called the cranium or cranial cavity, and that contains the brain and the eyes. The part of the skull that contains the eyes is called orbit. The part of the skull which contains the eyes is called orbit or orbital cavity. Next, we come to vertebral column and ribs. We have something called a girdle. A girdle means a cage or a bony enclosure in which internal organs are contained. This girdle in the trunk is called pectoral girdle. The girdle in the trunk is called pectoral girdle, and the girdle in the pelvic region is called pelvic girdle. We are studying the parts of the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle, as we have seen, is made up of the vertebral column posteriorly, the sternum anteriorly, and it is enclosed by the ribs at the sides. Now let's study each part in turn. First we'll do the vertebral column. The vertebral column is also called spine or backbone. Spine or backbone. Therefore, spine does not refer to the neural component of the vertebral column, but it refers to the bony component of the vertebral column. Therefore, spine means backbone. Now, the vertebral column as such is made up of 33 different pieces. Each piece is called a vertebra. Each piece is called a vertebra. Plural of vertebra is vertebrae. B-R-A-E. You add an E and it becomes a plural. Now, these vertebrae may be divided into portions where they lie. First, we have cervical region or the neck region made of 7 vertebrae. 7 cervical vertebrae. Now, this is constant to the class Mammalia. Now, we have 7 neck bones, and guess how many the giraffe has? It has 7 neck bones. Therefore, all the animal species belonging to the class Mammalia have 7 cervical vertebrae. So we have 7 neck bones. Next you have thoracic or dorsal region. This corresponds to the upper back. This is 12 vertebrae. So you have 12 thoracic or dorsal vertebrae. Next you have the lower back or the lumbar area. Lower back or the lumbar area, which has 5 vertebrae. These are the largest in the entire vertebral column because they bear the entire weight of the body. Therefore, the lumbar vertebrae are the largest and you have 5 of them. Next you have sacral region. Sacral vertebrae, there are 5 which are fused to form sacrum. They are not individual bones, but they are fused to form one bone called sacrum. Now the sacrum is made up of 5 fused sacral vertebrae. Next you have coccyx. To all the people who think that the human beings have lost their tail, this is a proof that we did have a tail at development. The coccyx is called the tailbone. The coccyx is called the tailbone. There are 4 coccygeal vertebrae and they also form a part of the sacrum. Therefore, 5 sacral vertebrae and the coccyx are fused to form the sacrum. So ultimately, the vertebral column is made of by 33 bones, but when you count them after the fusion, you end up with 26 bones. Therefore, when the vertebral column is formed, it's composed of 33 individual pieces, 7 in the cervical or neck region, 12 in the thoracic or dorsal region of the upper back. Lower back or lumbar region, there are 5 vertebrae and these are the largest of the lot. Next you have 5 sacral vertebrae and they are fused to form one bone called the sacrum. Next you have coccyx or tailbone. This is composed of 4 vertebrae, but they contribute to the formation of the sacrum. So this is the split up of the vertebral column. The sternum is also called the breastbone or manubrium sterni. Breastbone or manubrium sterni. This is the anterior part of the pectoral girdle. The vertebral column, as we have seen, forms the posterior part. The sternum is the anterior part. Now, this manubrium sterni has a process called a xiphoid process made of cartilage. The end of the sternum is called the xiphoid process made of cartilage. Now let's look at the ribs. There are 12 pairs of ribs. There are 12 pairs of ribs bilaterally. One portion of the rib articulates with the vertebral column. Now what is articulation? The part of the bone which meets another bone is flattened into a surface. The meeting point of two bones is called articulation. The meeting of two bones is called articulation. The facet or the flattened area of the bone which meets with the flattened other portion of the bone is called a articulating facet. Therefore, the flat surface of one bone articulates with the flat surface of another bone. This is called the articulating facet. Therefore, the rib articulates with the vertebra posteriorly and the sternum anteriorly. The ribs come from the vertebrae posteriorly to the sternum anteriorly, therefore forming a cage or a girdle. Now inside this girdle, all the soft tissues are protected from trauma. Now let's look at the 12 pairs of ribs. Now from the first cervical vertebrae onwards, you have articulation of the ribs. Ribs 1 to 7 pairs. The first 7 pairs of ribs are called true ribs. True ribs, which means that they articulate with the vertebrae at the back or posteriorly and they reach the sternum. Therefore, first 7 pairs of ribs are called true ribs. Now, the pairs from 8 to 10 are called false ribs. 8 to 10, the 8th pair to the 10th pair of ribs are called false ribs. Why? They articulate with the vertebrae posteriorly, but they fall short of the sternum anteriorly. They do not reach the sternum. Therefore, if you have, say this is the 6th pair, 7th pair articulating with the manubrium sterni, this is the xiphoid process. The 7th pair articulates here at the sternum, but the 8th rib comes from the back, does not reach the sternum, but articulates with the 7th rib by a costal cartilage, by a strip of cartilage. The 8th rib it articulates with the vertebrae at the back, but it does not reach the sternum. It falls short and articulates with the 7th rib itself with a piece of cartilage. That happens to the 8th, 9th and the 10th pairs. Now these 3 pairs of ribs are called